welcome to all of you. I'm Orville Schell, and I run the Center on U.S. China Relations here at the Asia Society. It's wonderful to be here with Winston and Dan in this joint venture with the Fletcher School, and Dan will explain a little more in a minute about that. You know, I think you all know Winston was sort of present at the creation of China policy back in '72. But actually, I hope we can also talk about how he looks back on the whole arc of his career, his life, and how did we get to where we are? And what should we all make of that? So just file that one away. Now, I thought just to begin before I turn it over to Dan, we have some, just 4 photos of, that maybe, well, there. There we go. So you all know that this sort of, this was 1972, and Winston will tell us more about it. And I don't, Winston, do you think it speaks for itself, or do you want to just tell us who we're looking at?
Why don't we wait till we have the conversation?
Okay, good. So this is, and here, this is a famous picture, as Winston will explain, because there he is on the right in Mao's study. And here he is with Zhou Enlai.
Looks like it was just taken yesterday. Just to...
Yeah, and here he is with Chairman Mao and Henry Kissinger looking on. And we're going to just leave this one up so you can absorb it as we go along. So Dan, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Orville. First of all, I want to extend my apologies. Some of you might have come here under the impression that Dean Kelly Sims Gallagher was going to be moderating this event. You probably noticed that I'm not Kelly Gallagher, which is a shame for all of us since she has much more China expertise than I do. Unfortunately, Kelly suffered a back injury about 10 days ago. And anyone, I can already see people in the audience wincing the moment I said the word back injury. Suffice to say that she was in no shape to be able to travel. She extends her deepest and profuse regrets that she cannot attend this function. She very much wanted to come, and indeed, honestly fought until the last minute to try to be able to do this until eventually she realized that it was not going to be possible. I also want to thank all of the Fletcher staff, alumni, and students who have come to this event. It is career week for Fletcher in New York, and so some of our students are venturing out to discover what the possible employment opportunities are after they graduate. It is possible that finding work in DC is not quite as attractive as it used to be for some of our graduates, so New York has some, potentially exciting opportunities, and who knows, maybe even the Asia Society is hiring, so I'm glad you're all here. And for everyone else who is a member of the Asia Society, thank you all very much for coming. Because you're all here, I don't think I need to extend that much of an introduction or a biographical sketch of Winston Lord. Obviously, he played a pivotal role in the U.S. opening to China. After that, he then served, among other things, as director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, U.S. ambassador to China during the Reagan administration. He was an assistant secretary of state during the Clinton administration, and so has served in government during truly critical junctures in Sino-American relations for the past 50 years. He is also, and this is no exaggeration to say, one of the most distinguished alumni of the Fletcher School that we have. And Fletcher can take some pride, I think, in the role that we played in getting Winston off to a sterling career, not just through education, but perhaps even more importantly, that Winston met his life partner, Betty Bowlord, who is in the front row and is also here, and really forged what I think is safe to say your first true diplomatic partnership. And we will talk about that a little more.
I don't know how diplomatic it is.
I'm going to assume it was diplomatic. So we want to talk a little bit about your sort of career in diplomacy. But I think I want to start with a just more basic question, which is, we were talking before, you grew up not just in New York, but in Manhattan, in the East Side, a couple blocks from here. How did you get interested in China in the first place?
First, let me make a few introductory comments, extend my concern to Dean Gallagher and my admiration. She's dealing in a very tough academic climate now. I wish she could be here. This meeting is a perfect professional and personal storm for me. You've got Fletcher, where I had one of the best years of my life, and as you say, not only prepared me for a diplomatic career, but also I met my wife. And the reason is that economics was my weakest subject. She took perfect notes in economic class, so I decided to be her friend. And we've been friends for 66 years. I'm delighted that Dan has been willing to come off the bench here, and I've followed his writings with admiration for many years on many subjects, but there's one you probably don't know about. I'm not making this up. He wrote a book on how you deal with a zombie outbreak.
The book is titled Theories of International Politics and Zombies, still in print. Feel free to buy it.
Okay. And then, of course, there's the Asia Society, the Center for China Affairs that Orville runs. Orville and I, although we went to grade school together, he was much younger than I was.
Well, one year.
One year, that's right. Golden friendship really is taking place in our golden years. And he's not only a good friend, but he refutes my maxim that a China expert is an oxymoron, or just a plain moron, because he brings a wisdom and a perspective that's unrivaled. It may be rivaled in terms of knowledge and history by a few in America, but no one rivals him in the elegance with which he expresses his views, including a fantastic novel, My Old Home, which you have to buy. It's his best work of all, better than all his nonfiction works.
And so Winston is always provides
Well,
a
it's true.
shameless commercial.
You
for
put all
me.
these things together, and this is obviously of great meaning for me, including, of course, the China theme, which is core of my career. To get to your question, I didn't have any particular interest in China, really, until I met Betty. And seriously, I began to learn about Chinese culture and history, her wonderful family and history. And so that's what got me going. Now, having said that, my marriage to Betty almost cut short my China career before it began, because Betty was a citizen of China. All her relatives were in China except the immediate family, so there was a security aspect. Therefore, there had to be an interview of her to approve our marriage. So we went over to see a GS-15 named Mr. Luck, and he put us all at ease by starting out by saying, now, I want you to know that if I don't approve this marriage, you can't get married and be in the Foreign Service, because you can go to the president and he can't overrule me. So that got us to be very relaxed. And I said, Mr. Lord, get out of here. So I'm going to interview her alone. So an hour and a half later, Betty comes out, and I asked her how it went. I am not making this up. Here are some of the questions she got. First question, who is Vidas Fisher? Second question, your husband's boss is coming home for dinner. He wants a death in the afternoon cocktail. How do you make a death in the afternoon cocktail? Third question, name the original 13 colonies in the order in which they joined the Union.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. Fourth question, name the starting offensive line of the Green Bay Packers. I'm not making it up. So anyway, they went through these questions, a few, I guess, more penetrating ones. Then he said, final question, what are you going to do, what is your husband going to do if I don't approve this marriage? So Betty said, he can find another career beside the Foreign Service. He cannot find another woman like me. So she passed the test. The final note, this has been billed as my Odyssey. It's not. It's a joint Odyssey. I'm going to make an enemy of my wife. Now she's going to cringe because she's the most modest person I've ever met, even though she's a best-selling author and won a presidential medal for human rights. But from the beginning, she has helped me interpret China, guide me through it. Nancy Reagan loved her novel Spring Moon and recommended to President Reagan that I be the ambassador, said you'll get 2 for the price of 1. And then she did a fabulous job as co-ambassador in China, which Orville almost got published a chapter on, as I understand it, in terms of an open period relatively in China, and did so much. So I owe her that. And the final point, because she's already mad at me, there are 4 key milestones in my career, after overlooking at my career. Each one was a turning point, and she steered me in the right direction. First one was to leave a successful career in the Foreign Service and take a more challenging job in the Defense Department, policy planning. Second was to become Kissinger's special assistant, knowing the insane hours and all the trips I'd be taking. Third one was to persuade me not to resign from the NSC because of our Cambodia policy in the 70s. And the fourth one is become ambassador to China, despite the fact my father was very sick and I didn't want to leave. She astutely observed that he would be much better for his health to have him see his son go to China as ambassador than staying home. So I just wanted to make that point at the beginning at the risk of ruining our 62-year-old marriage.
So, it looks pretty rock solid to me. I think you're on safe ground. Let's start by talking about the U.S. opening to China, and I'm wondering if you can set the stage a little bit. What do you think the motivation, if you would, you know, I'm old enough to know that if Richard Nixon, when he was elected, would never have been expected to engage in that opening. His reputation was as a hardline anti-communist. So what were the motivations of the United States, and what do you think the motivations of the Chinese were?
Well, the one aspect of the tea leaves you could have noticed was an article Nixon wrote in 1967 in Foreign Affairs magazine, which he said China should not be left out of the family of nations. It's too disruptive. Now, it was still a pretty hard line, but you could see he was thinking, as he always did, in strategic terms. So he came into office determined, for reasons I'll mention, to try to get in touch with China and start a relationship. On February 1st, 1969, 1 week after his inauguration, he sent a memo to Kissinger saying, get in touch with the Chinese. I want to see whether we can develop a new relationship. So it was one of his highest priorities. He had many incentives, but the initial one was this one of global stability. Kissinger, on the other hand, came in separately thinking we should move with China, but he was more influenced by the possibility of balancing the Soviet Union, and he picked this up from Eastern European diplomats in Europe. So they each came in determined to open up, but for different reasons, but they also shared the other one's perspectives as well. So the objectives on the Chinese side, then I get to the Americans, were essentially 2. One was to balance the polar bear to their north. So they had border clashes in '69, which Kissinger and Nixon immediately seized on. Drezner had invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. They declared themselves the master of the communist universe. And so they wanted to balance the near barbarian by having relations with the far barbarian, namely us, across the Pacific. Secondly, they wanted to break out of the diplomatic isolation. They were still in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. They had recalled every single ambassador around the world except the one to Egypt. And so they foresaw the opportunity to break this iceberg by opening up with the biggest enemy. On the U.S. side, we had several, some articulated, some inherent, but and this, along the following lines. One was to move toward 1/4 of the world's population, which is bound to be a power at some point, and the reasons Nixon and Kissinger shared. Secondly, to improve relations with Moscow by dealing with Beijing, not to hurt relations, but the famous triangular diplomacy. Third, Asian stability in general. Fourth, and I think this is very important in terms of the macro picture, by moving to establish relations in dramatic fashion with China, this served to put in perspective the inevitably messy outcome that was coming in Vietnam. At best, it was going to be ambiguous. So the American people already, you've got to remember the landscape they inherited of assassinations, riots, the war, all the other dimensions of a very tough 1960s. This would lift the morale of the American people by saying, we're moving to this huge country and putting in perspective a messy withdrawal from Southeast Asia. And so lifting the morale. And then finally, it would demonstrate to the world that we would not bog down in a Vietnam quagmire. We could move dramatically on the world scene. Now, spoiler alert, both sides achieved their goals. After they moved toward us, the Chinese saw Europe, Japan, others beginning opening up, but then they've been holding back because of us. And therefore, they broke out of their diplomatic isolation. They balanced the Soviet Union to deter the Soviets. They got into the United Nations. So they achieved their basic goals. We achieved the ones I mentioned, including one I left out, namely help in the Vietnam War. We were in the middle of secret negotiations. I was privileged to be part of that as well. And we figured Hanoi would notice if the two patrons were opening up with us at the same time. So we got help on that. Within weeks, the Russians, who had been dragging their feet on a summit, which we had offered to them, agreed to a summit, moved ahead on arms control, moved ahead on a Berlin Agreement, and so we dramatically improved relations right away with them. So as the Chinese like to say, it was a win-win situation.
They are fond of saying that. In terms of the opening to China, I mean, as you point out, there were interests on both sides in making it happen, but there's a lot of times in international relations where both sides might be interested in making something happen and it still doesn't happen. The details matter here. And so I was wondering if you could share with us at least some of the details of, let's say, before Nixon went, Kissinger went, obviously. What were the details involved in terms of arranging that trip and the actual trip itself?
I want to keep everyone in suspense. Some people think Nixon was the first person to enter China after 22 years since the communists took over in '49. Most people thought it was Kissinger, but of course, the really informed people like this panel know that I was there the first. And I'll get back to that. Well, the challenge was, in opening up, was to both establish private channels so we could talk to the Chinese. We had no communication except propaganda fests in Warsaw and Geneva. So how do we get in touch with them directly? We finally settled on a secret channel through Pakistan. And then publicly to begin prepare various audiences, not only American, but around the world, particularly our allies, that we were moving in this direction. And we took a series of unilateral economic relaxations and using nomenclature and so on, beginning to prepare that. So that was the general context. Once we started communicating with the Chinese through Pakistan, and the way that would happen is that Joe and I would write a note, they'd give it to the Pakistani president, who would give it to his ambassador in Washington, who would come and see Kissinger, and I was always there. And these were handwritten notes, and then Henry and I would draft a response. As we got closer to 1971, there was some hesitation, it seemed, from the Chinese side. Then there was this ping-pong event. I won't go into detail now because I want to keep my answers short. But in any event, finally, in the spring of '71, the Chinese agreed to have an envoy. In this case, Kissinger was chosen to his glee, and by Nixon, who obviously trusted him the most. But the important thing here, to get back to your question, was originally in our correspondence with Beijing, they said, come to China and let's talk about Taiwan. You've got to remember that since '49, in any exchanges with the Chinese in Warsaw and Geneva, they always said, before we can have any movement, you got to make real moves on Taiwan. We refused to go to China until they agreed to an agenda that was much broader than that. So once we got that, we settled on that, and off we took. And I can get into the trip itself if you'd like.
Please.
And then we ought to make sure Orville weighs in here at some point. First challenge for me in the trip was whether or not I would tell my wife, Betty. She's, after all, born in Shanghai. We shared all secrets. Kissinger knew we had this relationship and said, this is the one guy, I don't mind you telling her about secret negotiations on Vietnam or dealing with the Russians, secret trips in the Middle East shuttles, but on China, because she's Chinese, you just can't tell her we're going there, because we were going to go on a public trip, hiding our private segue into Beijing.
It was to Pakistan, right?
We went to Vietnam and India and Thailand and Pakistan. So I promised Henry that I would not tell Betty. Of course I was going to tell Betty. So how did I square this circle? We were packing, I was packing to go on this public trip, which nobody knew, of course, we were going to Beijing. And I called Betty over to the window. Now, in those days, Beijing was called Peking. So I told her to look out the window and say, look, I think I see a Peking Tom. That's all I said. She's pretty smart. She picked it up. So ever since, I've been able to tell Henry. I never told her about it, and of course I told her about it. Unfortunately, when I called her, my mother-in-law, as I was saying goodbye, she was just as smart as her daughter. She said, and she had no way of knowing this. I obviously didn't tell her. She said, I hope you enjoy your Peking duck. I was just flabbergasted. So anyway, we go off on a plane that was quite small. Air Force Two was taken over by somebody else, the vice president or something. And so I had the assignment of being in charge of the briefing books, and Henry acknowledges this in his memoirs. We had 3 sets of briefing books on this plane. Again, it was quite small and very noisy. One set was for the 4 of us going to Beijing, plus 2 Secret Service. And so that had everything about what we were going to say and what's going to happen and biographies. The second set of briefing books were for those 3 or 4 additional people who knew we were going but weren't going with us and had to provide the cover for our trip. And the third, and the most people on that plane, were India, Pakistan, Thailand, Vietnam experts who didn't know about the trip at all. So every time we did a revision in the briefing book, we had to do 3 different books all over again. So I would do a revision as we're flying over the Pacific, and I'd go to sleep. And of course, Henry has been asleep. He'd wake up, and he's never satisfied with anything. So he said, no, you got to redo all this. So I'd have to redo all 3. So both the substance and the fatigue and the juggling act of the 3 different books was a challenge, but obviously exhilarating. So we get on, I won't go to these because I don't want to keep these answers shorter, but we get on the plane secretly from Pakistan. As we get on the plane, we're greeted by 4 Chinese that Joe and I sent to greet us, and our Secret Service didn't know we were going to China, and one of them drew his pistol. He couldn't understand what these Chinese were doing on our plane. As we're flying over the Pacific, pretty dramatic stuff. This is a geopolitical earthquake we're about to set off, right? Secondly, we're going to meet Joe and Lai and deal with the Chinese. It's been 22 years. Thirdly, the James Bond secrecy aspect. Fourthly, my wife is born in Shanghai. I'm going back to her native land. So what was Kissinger thinking about? He didn't have any decent shirts. His staff assistant forgot to pack his shirt. And so he was ranting and raving, not worrying about Joe and Lai or anything else. He said, well, I'm going to look ridiculous. So a man named John Holdridge, who's 6'3", lent him his shirt. He went around looking like a penguin.
What? I was going to say, that doesn't work body type-wise.
No.
Yeah.
And of course, the shirt had a label that said, made in Taiwan. So in any event, while this fracas was going on, I made sure I was to get to a point we were talking about in the green room. Yeah. I made sure I was in the front of the plane. Henry and everyone else is in the back of the plane. So as we went over the Chinese border, I beat Kissinger into China.
You were literally his advancement.
Exactly, by a millisecond. Now, I'll be glad to pick up on the substance.
Yeah, I was going to say, we should talk about
This is not all going to be light anecdotes, but I think it's sort of fun, and it does illustrate certain points. But Orville, you may want to jump in here at this point. I'll get to the trip if you'd like.
Well, yeah, get to the trip. I have
okay.
Yeah, I mean, we should get to the
We
Shanghai,
had
the drafting of Shanghai.
2 objectives on the trip.
Yeah.
You got to remember, this was kept secret because we had 23 years of hostility. We fought each other in Korea. This was going to be a shock to the system. And if it was public that we were taking a real gamble that it might not work. And if it was public, every country in the world would be at the White House lobbying what we should and should not do. There would be tremendous political and congressional debates, and it would just hem us in completely. So I think the secrecy was justified. We can talk about some of the downsides. We had to do this secretly. I just lost my train of thought here.
We could
Oh,
talk-
into the substance, we had
Yeah.
two basic goals. One, we wanted to see whether or not a trip was justified. We couldn't just send Nixon in cold. And secondly, what would the agenda of such a summit meeting be like? So those were objectives. We were there 49 hours, 17 hours of negotiations. It was clear there was enough in common as well as clear differences that it could make for a successful trip. And then the second objective was to draft a communique announcing it. And of course, it was so dramatic, you didn't need a long text. So we just had a brief communique that was issued a few days later announcing it. So both of those were successful. And of course, it had a dramatic impact around the world. It moved the Soviets immediately, as I said earlier. It helped us marginally, not fundamentally, on the Vietnam negotiations, and it turned out to be very popular, which Nixon and others didn't even realize would be the case until we flew home after the summit. So that was the basic sinews of the secret trip. Interestingly enough, we went back via Paris and had a secret meeting with the North Vietnamese and thought we had made a breakthrough in that as well. It turns out to be illusory, but it was a positive meeting, so we thought we'd not only opened with China, but maybe it ended the Vietnam War in one trip.
First of all, the whole idea of redrafting the briefing books, I can see Fletcher students cringing in sort of thinking about needing to constantly revise their papers. So, that's why we make you do it. One of the sort of hardy perennial questions in terms of Cold War diplomacy, particularly during the Nixon years, is was it Nixon or was it Kissinger that was the architect of this? And I'm sort of curious what your answer to this question is.
Well, the answer was it was both, obviously. And Kissinger's the first to acknowledge Nixon's absolutely indispensable role. He had to make the tough decisions, the courage to do this, because a lot of his own people, although that gave him some protection on his flank, and Humphrey would have had an even tougher time, but still, it was a courageous decision. And he would give the strategic guidance, which he and Kissinger agreed on what we're trying to achieve and how to do it, and he would follow closely what happened. Then he would, smart enough to delegate to Henry, and Henry's indispensable role as negotiator and diplomat and managing this. So it couldn't have been done without Nixon's vision and courage. It couldn't have been done without Kissinger's vision and diplomatic and tactical skill. And as I said, they both came into office wanting to do this.
This leads to the drafting of the Shanghai communique, and I was just sort of, how does that happen, and what was your role?
In any summit meeting, you all know, and certainly Fletcher graduates know, that you want to have the outcome predetermined. You don't go in blind. So we went back for a public trip in October.
To be fair to them, in recent summits, that hasn't happened, so I get why they...
And maybe future.
Yeah.
So in October '71, we went back in, both for logistical reasons, to set up the itinerary of the president's trip and the media arrangements and security and so on, but also to further the agenda and to start drafting the Shanghai communique. And this was quite a process. We went in and gave a draft to the Chinese of a fairly conventional communique for a summit, sort of stressing the positive aspects, without being naive, but still.
Yeah.
We gave it to Zhou Enlai. The next day, he came back and almost literally threw it on the floor and said, "This is absurd." And he'd obviously checked with the chairman. We fought each other in Korea. We were enemies for 22 years, and suddenly we're going to have a kumbaya summit. I mean, give me a break. He didn't put it quite like that. He's a little more elegant than that. He said, let's try a different approach. And that is, let's have each side state its perspectives, both ideology and philosophy, and on specific issues like Vietnam, Soviets, Japan, Middle East, and so on. Then we can state a few areas where we have convergence, and they'll be more credible against the backdrop of candor of our differences. We had two reactions. One, we saw the brilliance of this new idea. And by the way, it's lasted as a meaningful document ever since. How many diplomatic communiques are still used and referred to 50 or 60 years later? At the same time, we were somewhat panicked because we were leaving Beijing in about 48 hours. Now, to show Nixon's trust in Henry, there wasn't great communications in those days, so Henry had to do this on his own without checking with Washington. we agreed to the Chinese approach and had me do a redraft of the U.S. positions and the joint positions until 4 a.m., in which I was supposed to wake him up, in which he took it over and then polished it off. More than that, obviously he was the key guy in this. And so we did that, and by the time we left, 48 hours later, we had solved, most of the issues except Taiwan, which is a little bit like, how'd you like to play, Mrs. Lincoln, But, so the Taiwan issue was still there, and we came back to that during the summit. And let me make a point on Taiwan. Obviously, if you're going to open up with China, you have to address that issue. I've already explained that we wouldn't let that dominate the agenda, but we obviously had to make some gesture. We came up with a formula that's sufficiently useful and ambiguous that it's still working 60 years later. About 4 people in the world understand it, but it's working, the ambiguity of it. And so it was enough to give the Chinese enough, basically, I won't go into detail, but both sides of the strait saw, China being one whole and so on. And so people say, some of the right wing would say, well, we sold out Taiwan. Of course it was a shock to Taiwan. They could see the direction it was happening. But remember the Chinese position from the beginning, you can't do anything, we can't move ahead unless you solve or have great progress in Taiwan. That's all they got in Taiwan. What do we get? We maintained diplomatic relations with Taiwan, we maintained our defense treaty, we maintained troops on Taiwan, and we maintained military aid. So to say that, I'm not saying we didn't have to make an effort, but to say we sold out Taiwan, obviously it's going to be painful, but I would argue that we had a very successful outcome there.
And it obviously paved the way for Nixon's trip to China. And I was sort of wondering, you were in the room, as the pictures show. What were your impressions in terms of personalities, in terms of leadership of Mao and of Zhou Enlai?
Okay, and then I do want to get Orville involved in this. Yeah, but I'll do this, and then it's your turn to ask me a question. First, Zhou Enlai. Kissinger has said, and I agree, although I've met much fewer leaders than he has, that Zhou Enlai was the single most impressive diplomat he ever met. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about both these guys. They're ruthless communists. They're not people to be admired in many ways, so I'm not sugarcoating who they were. In the case of Zhou Enlai, he had a tremendous grasp of history, philosophy, culture, as well as a grasp of his immediate briefing books. He didn't have any briefing books. He had it all in his head. So Nixon and Kissinger had to take the books, which I and others had prepared, and sort of hide them so they could look equal in terms of memory and acuity. And Zhou was very good at reflecting the Chinese diplomatic approach of stating at the beginning what you really need, not inflating it artificially, and then trying to work so each side can meet the other side's objectives in red lines. Kissinger was a genius at adapting to various negotiating styles. The Vietnam used negotiations to wear you down, and they weren't serious. They were trying to use it for American public opinion. The Soviets, you'd have to haggle like rug merchants, inflating your positions and then bargaining down toward the middle. The Israelis, very uneasy because of their history and their neighbors, would examine every single detail. But with the Chinese, he was most comfortable with this approach. And Zhou Enlai was fantastic. Now, he also was very charismatic, that overused word, and he used gestures both to show some humanity, but also to further his goals of you're becoming his friend. I'll give you a few examples, but first on the intellectual side, and maybe the sense of humor side. Henry and Zhou Enlai used to have philosophic and historical discussions when they got through the regular agenda. So Henry asked Zhou Enlai, what do you think the impact of the French Revolution was? Zhou Enlai said, it's too soon to tell, expressing the long view of the Chinese. Now, some people tried to ruin that story by saying he was Henry was to the Paris street riots a few weeks before. That's nonsense, because I know what Henry was asking, and I know what Zhou Enlai was saying. So that's sort of his style. Now, he did other things. One of our staff members got sick. He sent his own personal doctor over to take care of her. On a subsequent trip after the summit, Kissinger and I would often talk outside the Dacha guest house because we knew they were bugged, which was useful because I used to say I hate sea slugs and we wouldn't have them at dinner, so that was good. But we would walk and we got to a certain bridge and we couldn't cross it. A PLA or a police person would stand up and stop us from crossing. And we couldn't figure this out. We didn't tell anybody about this. The final night with Joe and I, we finished the discussions, and Joe and I took the unprecedented step as Prime Minister versus National Security Advisor of walking Henry personally home to our dacha, and guess what? He walked us over that bridge without saying a word. It turns out I think Sihanouk or somebody was staying and it was security, but the point is that was the kind of gesture he would make. One final example, and then I'll get to Mao. I was secretly in the meeting between Mao and Nixon, but I was cut out of all the communiques and the photographs because they didn't want to hurt the absent Secretary of State's image any further. So it was tough enough to him not be there, but to have a 30-year-old punk sitting there and he wasn't, that's another thing.
With, by the way, the most awesome sideburns I've ever seen. I just want to get that on the record.
I'm sorry?
Your sideburns in the photos are
exactly.
epic. Just go ahead.
So for a couple of years, except for my wife and 4 or 5 other people, nobody knew anyone was in that meeting with Mao except Nixon and Kissinger. In a trip about a year after the summit, maybe sooner, just with Kissinger, we were talking with Zhou Enlai, and he announced that Chairman Mao wanted to see wanted to see Henry Kissinger and Winston Lord. Now, the chairman wouldn't know me from Lady Gaga, although he knew, of course, I was in the meeting. And then after that meeting with Mao, Zhou Enlai gave me this picture to prove I was there, not this one, but the one with Mao, proving I was there secretly. So that's the kind of gestures he would make. Now, Mao, totally different story. Henry and I were somewhat disappointed by Mao in the initial meeting. We were used to Zhou Enlai's Mandarin elegance and long dissertations. Mao spoke Socratically in terms of questions and using brushstrokes, a sentence or two and nothing else. I mean, he was very sick. And so therefore, part of this was stamina, but it was also his strategy. He didn't get into details. He kept saying that's up to Zhou Enlai and the Prime Minister. So he would just say a simple sentence but very pregnant sentences. Taiwan can wait for 100 years. I'm concerned about the polar bear to the north. I haven't changed much in China, just a few things outside Beijing. Our propaganda tirades against you are empty cannons. We like conservatives. These kind of things, literally no longer than that. So we were somewhat puzzled and disappointed, but then we realized over the next few days as we negotiated with Zhou Enlai, the brilliance of this seemingly haphazard brushstroke approach. Basically, he set up the basic deal of the summit. We will postpone intractable problems like Taiwan for another day. We can't solve them now, so we can get off with immediate objectives like balancing the Soviet Union. Final point. So Mao was impressive in terms of his willpower. I do have to tell one anecdote about my last meeting, which was the 5th meeting with Mao with President Ford. The willpower he had then was unbelievable. When he would, in a meeting, he would grunt one sentence, and his interpreter, Nancy Tang, would go on for about 5 minutes. We never figured out what was going on. I think he was saying, my Taiwan policy is number 1, or Soviet policy is number 2, and just uttered the number. In any event, as Ford came into the meeting, the chairman said to Ford, "I will soon receive an invitation from God." Not from Marx, by the way, but from God. Ford was a little puzzled. At the end of the meeting, he gets up, shakes the chairman's hand. "Mr. Chairman, enjoyed this meeting, and I want you to know that I hope you get that invitation from God very soon.
Oh, no.
The translator, of course, said the president wishes you 10,000 years or something.
It was good work by Nancy.
I have
Tang.
another Ford story, but I'll save it. This has gone on long enough. Okay.
One last thing before we fast forward a little bit, which is my understanding is you apparently, you obviously interacted with Zhou Enlai. You also interacted with Deng Xiaoping.
Right.
And that was a little more contentious?
Well, Deng is a mixed character. He was unlike any other leader we met. Much more lively, inventive, off script. He was very short. His legs didn't reach the ground. He used a spittoon. In our meetings, he generally was very positive on U.S. China relations and on reforms of opening up to the world. And whenever visitors came, we usually had a trifecta where we have the foreign minister at first, sort of nuts and bolts. Then we have the hardline Prime Minister Li Peng giving us a real tough time. And then Deng would be sort of a soothing finale, and so on. So my verdict on Deng is that it's mixed. Obviously, what he did to open up China and relations with us, and China's miracle in the last 30 years of what they've accomplished is above all due to him, and he deserves credit for that. But he was very hardline on political matters, even though he would go back and forth on campaigns sometimes. He was Mao's frontman in the anti-rightist campaign. He got into leadership, moved aside Hua Guofeng partly by using a dissident named Wei Jingxing in Democracy Wall, and then imprisoned him after he got in. He dispensed with two relatively moderate party secretaries, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yabang, while he was General Secretary, and he ordered the massacre in Tiananmen Square. So it's a mixed bag. Now, I did have one run-in with him which foreshadowed Tiananmen Square. This is when I was ambassador in June 1988, almost exactly a year before Tiananmen. Betty and I were asked to go speak to Chinese students at Beijing University, what came to be known as Democracy Salon, where they had all kinds of speakers. We didn't realize it was sensitive at the time. So we were very careful not to do anything provocative or get the students in trouble with agents in the crowd. I even praised Deng's foreign policy with us and reforms. 2 days later, I was at a banquet, and the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., who was on home leave, came up and gave me a withering statement personally from Deng Xiaoping, which is very unusual to the ambassador, basically saying in somewhat restrained terms, you should not be going out and meeting with the students without checking with us first. I gave an immediate verbal response that was very firm, frankly, but it was polite. I said, that's unacceptable. Part of my job is to meet as many Chinese, particularly young people, as possible. So in effect, I said, I'm going to ignore Mr. Deng, your thing. Well, for 2 weeks, mysteriously, every engagement that Betty and I had with universities and think tanks was canceled. And this went on for some time, but they finally got us back to normal. So I did have that personal, unusual run-in with Deng.
Interesting. Well, this is a nice segue to your years as ambassador to China. And as you say, it was a partnership. You were ambassador. Betty also certainly played a prominent role. I guess we don't have a ton of time, so I want to talk actually first about Tiananmen, which is, as ambassador, did you have any inkling about what was going to happen, I guess?
Well, this run-in with Deng was an inkling, how sensitive they were, particularly with students. The second one was President Bush came in February 1989. I'm not going to take the time to go into what happened, but basically the summit was ruined because the Chinese prevented a noted Chinese dissident who we invited for human rights purposes, but not being overly provocative in a big banquet, kept him from coming. And so the sensitivity there gave us some inkling. But no one saw the scale of what was going to happen in Tiananmen. We could see some unrest, but not at the gigantic demonstrations all over China that took place.
And I mean, I guess you were there during simultaneously the opening and then, what happens in sort of Tiananmen. I mean, I guess one question I have is, one of the things I've learned, studying diplomacy is that particularly during the 20th century, it wasn't just the ambassador that played a role. It was your spouse that also played an important role.
Well, I'd like to get Betty in here. But we were very lucky. If someone could give her a microphone, we were very lucky over her dead body, I might add. But
we're getting to the question, we promise.
Yeah, the basic, we were very lucky to be there at a time when China was relatively open. And so I'd like Betty to give some sense of what she was able to do along with our embassy colleagues while we were there.
The way I would put it is, what event did you run or what thing did you do when you were there that you are most proud of in retrospect?
I think it was probably asking Charlton Heston to come and direct the most famous Beijing troupe to do K Mutiny. And during, it was a wonderful, wonderful exchange, even though they didn't speak English, the actors didn't speak English, and obviously Charlton Heston didn't speak Chinese. But to tell you what kind of an impact one person can have to a whole group, he would direct them by getting on his knees to the actor and telling him, this is what I think you should do with your hands or whatever. And everybody just gasped because nobody ever thought a director would ever kneel in front of a common actor. Also, I think that during Tiananmen Square, the whole cast of K Mutiny marched as a group with K Mutiny signs.
Betty, tell them a little bit of some of the events we had at the embassy you were able to do, which would be unthinkable today or almost any other period of relationship.
I wish he wouldn't ask me questions.
You'll notice I had him ask you rather than me. I'm diplomatic that way. Keep going.
Well, one of the things we had at the embassy at the time, we were very lucky. It was the most open time there was. The Chinese were wanted to open up to America. Americans wanted to open up to the Chinese. For instance, on July 4th, we would have 1,000 people at the embassy. The hamburgers were donated by McDonald's. The drinks were donated by Pepsi. The screens, the awnings, were donated by the Air Force because they were their used parachutes. So at a time that before that, all July 4th celebrations were held at the embassy with not one Chinese there. So it was incredible. I used to have the best movies from China because I think they were interested in finding out about our culture, and we were interested in showing them our arts. And every week, we would have the first-run movies flown over, and we would show it, and we would have everybody invited, from students to communist leaders to everybody, including Deng Xiaoping's son. And they would all enjoy it together. One time, we showed Color Purple, which showed just how horrible slavery was in our country. And people were aghast that I would show something so shameful about America. But I said, you know, they have the right to make such films like this in America, and that was the point.
You know,
Thank you.
if I could add something, I think in a certain sense, Betty underplays what an extraordinary hub of activity the embassy was. And I used to go all the time to your parties and meet the most amazing collection of people. Now, yes, the Chinese Communist Party at that time allowed that to happen. But in the very best sense, I think the embassy became a projector of American culture, brought people over, but also assembled all sorts of people from all walks of life in China. And it was quite an extraordinary moment in history. Winston, I want to ask one sort of question, just maybe before we take questions from you all. I think the reason why people are so fascinated with what you and Henry Kissinger and Nixon did was because it was a real tipping point moment in history where something actually happened and it had a certain cast of characters which were interesting. Do you think it's possible that such a moment could be replicated now when we are again at a stage of kind of grave standoff with China?
No. Then I give you a short answer for June.
No, I want a longer answer.
Okay. No, first of all, you don't have, certainly on the American side and also on the Chinese side, the kind of strategic vision. I'd say there's more on the Chinese side at this point. But secondly, China is now relatively equal versus the relationship we had then, which sets up a whole different dynamic, historical rising power versus established power. The era of secrecy and being able to do things behind closed doors and making progress is over. You just don't have the personalities or the international context to pull this off.
So do you think if we did have the personalities, the sort of geopolitical context of China on the rise would prevent us from having this kind of maybe some major diplomatic breakthrough?
No, I think the best you could do, and it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future, would be the leaders, and it has to come from the leaders these days, have a meeting of the minds, at least in terms of fully understand the strategic objectives, the red lines, the fundamental goals, the areas of flexibility and the areas of cooperation in a strategic sense. Like the U.S. is not trying to keep China down, China's not trying to replace the U.S., that kind of thing, but in much more strategic and meaningful terms. That would be the ideal. And it's possible, if we can get through this next few years with leadership leaving something to be desired on both sides of the Pacific, it's possible that we can work out such a modus vivendi. It would never be quite as dramatic as we did it, but it could be equally important.
Well, God willing.
Before we get to questions, I did want to ask you one last one, which is, in part, the opening to China, part of the reason that was successful was precisely because it was so secret, and it was possible for it to be secret. There was no social media then. There was no there was a very limited internet. It was possible for someone like Kissinger to go undetected into China. I guess my question is that would anything like that be possible in the 21st century, where, you know, open source intelligence is now just much more vast than it used to be?
No, the answer is no. It's not possible. So I've given you two short answers.
This is great.
Let me make clear to the audience, this has been too much about me. I think we should segue. I'm welcome more questions about the past, but we should segue to where we are now and where we're going and what the prospects are, because I know we want to get into that, not just make just a personal history.
So if you have questions, raise your hand, and let's keep them very brief because we have a short period of time. Who would like to be first? Question right here.
Ambassador, what do you think?
Well, wait for the microphone, please. And just tell us who you are and then quickly ask your question.
Dave Hawk. What do you think Trump won and Biden should have done differently on China policy?
Did you hear that? The question
Yeah,
was,
no, I understand.
what could have been
okay.
done differently for Trump 1 or Biden with respect to China diplomacy?
By the end of the the Obama administration, pre-Trump 1, it was clear that under Xi, we were on a much different relationship with China. We had tried engagement. I don't think there was an alternative. China was going to grow without our help because of the vitality of its people, the size of its population, and Deng Xiaoping's reform. And we never could have gotten other countries to line up with us, so containment wasn't possible. But we were trying to cooperate, and we had made some progress under engagement, even though we'd suffered some losses. But by the end of Biden's term, of Obama's term, we saw what Xi was up to. The Chinese started turning and becoming more obnoxious in 2008 under Hu Jintao because of the financial crisis. They saw that we messed things up for the world as well as our own economy. They survived that crisis much better than we did, and they began to feel more self-confident. They had grown in military, economic power and diplomatic power. They had the Olympics, and Hu Jintao was fooling around in the South China Sea. So it began to turn then, but the real difference came under Xi, and that's what Trump and Biden had to deal with. Trump 1 did have the virtue of making clear that engagement, as previously defined, which I don't think was wrong, but just was now outdated, had to be changed. We needed a firmer policy. But he took, machetes instead of scalpels to the relationship, and I think he did not approach it. It was more transactional. It was inconsistent, but had the virtue of being somewhat firmer. I think the Biden administration had it about right. And I say this as someone who is not a profound left-winger or anything like that. I've worked for Reagan. I worked for Clinton. I voted for policy of both parties, so I'm trying to be fair here. But I do think the basic, I don't have much quarrel to get to the part of the question about what Biden did. Adjusted our policy much firmer, and we, in a task force co-headed by Orville, we wrote several task force papers to this effect. And I think it had some impact thanks to the Asia Society and University of California at San Diego. Basically, the approach was invest, align, compete, and cooperate. Invest meaning build up our own soft and hard power so we can compete with China. Align means work with allies for leverage against China. Cooperate where you could on global issues like climate change and non-proliferation, pandemics, but be firm where you had to and put off problems that were intractable. And I think on the whole, they were handling it about right. Now, I think Trump has now destroyed that in this Trump 2, but in terms of Trump 1, where Trump gets some credit for steering the ship in a different direction, and the Biden approach, I think, was much more sophisticated. We're now pursuing a very self-inflicting wound policy, but we can leave that for another question.
Okay, more questions. There's another one right here.
I'm also going to encourage the Fletcher School.
William Lemmy, I'd like to get your point of view about the war in Vietnam and Kissinger and Nixon's policies. Why was it such a disaster in Cambodia and Vietnam with the loss of life? Weren't they able to pressure the Chinese more?
I'm sorry, I got the first part. Why was it a disaster?
The question was whether you could pressure China more on Vietnam.
Well, we did put pressure on China and Russia. They were moderately helpful. They were not about to sell out their friend Vietnam, their neighbor Vietnam in the case of China. And also they were competing for influence against each other. So there were limits in what they were willing to do. They didn't stop aid. So I'm not saying it was dramatic. But in the case of the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Russians, they realized that if this war could be ended quickly, it would free up tension between U.S. and China. We wouldn't have this hanging over us. Also, they saw that for the U.S. to be humiliated by a overthrowing the Saigon government, which we've refused to do, and that's what held up the settlement, we would look weak as an international player, and this didn't help their objective of balancing the Soviet Union. So they did press, and Joe and I went to Hanoi and so on, pressed the Vietnamese to settle for a military settlement only. The Vietnamese were insisting that we not only withdraw unilaterally, but we overthrow the Thieu government on the way out. And we refused to do that, and they finally dropped that demand. So we did get some help. I don't want to get off into Vietnam and to what extent it was a disaster in many ways, but I can explain much more, but that's not the subject of this conference, so I'll hold off on that.
Can I ask one follow-up question, not so much about Vietnam, but about Cambodia? You said that Betty convinced you not to resign, that you could do more good from the inside. But it does raise the interesting question, which I do think, unfortunately, is relevant in 2025, which is, in your career, did you have red lines personally that if it had been crossed, you would have resigned?
Of course. A real challenge, and this would be relevant to Fletcher graduates who go into international service or serve governments, and it's relevant if you're serving a controversial administration like the present one or Trump one or any administration. You've got to balance off several factors. What can you do for the interests of your country? What can you do for your own career? But how do you adhere to your moral and ethical principles? So yes, there would be certain lines that I would feel if I crossed, I would have to do it. Now, my view was the following, and my first interview with Kissinger, when I had never met him before, we got a little bit into this, the question of loyalty. My view is if you're working for a government administration, if you don't like a policy, you debate vigorously. And I wrote memos to Henry. That's how I became a special assistant. He didn't like yes men or yes women. He wanted candor, and he hired me as a special assistant because I wrote some memos to him criticizing our policy. So you debate within, but if you lose the fight, you have to carry out the policies faithfully. If they're so repugnant to you morally or geopolitically even, then you resign. But if you have other interests, as we well did in the case of ending the Vietnam War, opening the Soviets, Middle East shuttles, all the other things we were doing, not to mention China, then you stay on and carry it out. The one thing you don't do is leak. You do not leak and subvert a policy. You either stay in, work faithfully, wait for another day on issues, or you get out and you can carry out your protests. But you can't have a little bit of each.
Maybe, let's see, Fletcher students, why don't you raise your hands? Okay,
Seeing
there's one right here in the middle. Yes, that row.
Be sure to identify yourself.
Thank you for everyone for being here. My name is Ning Yuan, a Fletcher student from Peking. And before I start, my grandmother was a dancer in the art troupe to welcome your convoy to the China in the 70s. So I'll pass this picture to her to see if she remembers you. My question is also for everyone. So leaders and countries, they learn from history. So in your experience of dealing with the Chinese government officials, what's your impression of what kind of lessons they learned back in the days from how the U.S. handled their relations with the USSR, and what are the current lessons that the Chinese are learning from that history of how the USSR has fallen and how the U.S. handles its relationship with Russia also? Thank you.
Well, I think he's asking the ability of the Chinese leadership to learn from history, particularly in regard to Russia and the Soviet Union. I mean, do you think they're able to digest the lessons of history well?
Is that a fair rendition? I want to get your question right.
Yes.
Okay, and Daniel here knows a lot about Russia too. That really raises the issue, I think, of Sino-Soviet relations and how lasting they are. On the one hand, those relations are stronger than ever, and certainly a complete contrast to what we were dealing with in the 70s and 80s in triangular diplomacy. Both of them want to resist American hegemony as they see it, change the world order run by America, oppose sanctions, interference in domestic affairs, human rights discussions. They join together in United Nations votes. They join together in other votes. They have meaningful displays like the recent parade in Beijing with Putin there. China is helping the war effort without violating sanctions technically, but with spare parts, and they're keeping it alive. And by buying so much Soviet oil, they're keeping that machine going in Moscow. Putin, in turn, helps them on Taiwan while they help Putin on Ukraine. They both have a sense of sphere of influence, which, by the way, Trump is tempted by. Their trade has gone up quite a bit. It's about $1 billion now. So there's a lot of factors at work that make this a very tactical difficulty for us. Now, having said that, I think there are limits, and this is not going to last. It's a real formidable in the short term. But over the long run, I don't think it'll last for several reasons. Number one, their history, not only the border clashes, but going back in history in China, feeling that the Soviets have taken a good part of their land, a lot of empty land in Siberia, and a lot of Chinese on the other side, although declining population. The Russians are basically racist in many ways in their discussions with us on China. There's suspicion on both sides. They have different interests in certain areas like Central America. The Soviets are declining in power. China's rising in power. That's going to create tensions and little brother kind of thing. So I think over time, if we have a more intelligent policy at our end, that won't be quite so lips and teeth as it is today. Therefore, I think China does, to get to your question, consider Russian history and the implications for China, and that'll make both sides a little bit wary of each other, even as they cooperate for common objectives in the near term.
Well, let's take one more Fletcher student. I see a very ardent hand right here.
By the way, just to follow up, I would add that you should read Fletcher professor Christopher Miller wrote a great book about the history of Russia's turn eastward from Peter the Great onward. And the theme of that book is that there's always a romance that it can turn east, and that romance never quite plays out the way they intended.
Thank you for sharing tonight. I'm Preston. I'm a Fletcher student from Hong Kong, having practiced human over the last 6 years during crackdown. So I'm asking this question with very heavy heart and also every reason of my existence. So in 1972, there was a vote at the UN to remove Hong Kong from the list of non-self-governing territory, and the result was that.
Put the microphone a little closer. Yeah.
Sorry. Hong Kong was removed from the list of non-self-governing territory in 1972. The effect was that we could no longer go through decolonization and the right to a democratic future. My grandparents were all four refugees from communist China seeking liberty. Safety in Hong Kong, my parents would be first generation in Hong Kong, having witnessed Tiananmen from afar. My generation, many of whom first generation university student, and many of whom are in jail now as political prisoner. And for generations, this would be this collective search for life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I wanted to ask Mr. Kissinger this question, as I'm also.
I don't quite understand. Can we get to the question?
He's got to do the
Sorry.
question.
So the question is, what could have been done about Hong Kong with the information of in 1982, 72?
Please repeat that last sentence. What could happen to?
What could have been done differently with information available about Hong Kong in 1972 with that UN vote?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
I think he's saying that there was a vote in the UN to essentially delist Hong Kong as a particular jurisdiction, and he, as a former resident of Hong Kong, wants to know, could anything have been done differently in 72?
Well, the Hong Kong situation is tragic, in my opinion. It's become another Chinese city. It doesn't have its distinctive flavor of law and autonomy that it used to have, and so it's very discouraging. I don't know what anybody could have done from the outside. The Chinese just have too much weight geographically and through the distortion of the treaties to have prevented it. So it's very disturbing. I feel badly for the people of Hong Kong, who are tremendous. but I'm afraid it's going down a very dreary path. Well, I think we should go to another question.
Yes, let's do one more question. I think maybe the last question right over here. The young woman.
Hi, I'm from Taiwan, and my question is, was the United States aware of the April 26th editorial, and what was the response? During Tiananmen Square, sorry.
Was the United States aware
Of the April 26th editorial of the People's Daily.
This is where Deng Xiaoping's
Yes.
editorial, maybe tell us what aspect of that you would like Ambassador Lloyd.
Were you aware of that beforehand, and what was your response, and what we're going to do about it after that editorial came out, and I mean, general
This
aspect.
is where Deng Xiaoping put an editorial in the People's Daily saying that the students were making turmoil and not purely democratic. And that stirred them all up again. And I guess you're asking what?
What was the response from the United States?
Yeah, I was no longer ambassador there. Betty and I, we were very lucky not only to have an open period in China, but we left on the day of Hu Yaobang's funeral, which produced the first mass demonstrations, 100,000, but I was not there during Tiananmen. But you're right, Betty went back to cover it after we left, and saw it firsthand for CBS. But that editorial was crucial. Zhao Ziyang was trying to maneuver a response that would be more sympathetic to the students, address some of their concerns, set up channels of communication. And Deng, with Li Peng and other hardliners, overruled it. So I don't know what, I'm sure the embassy at the time made clear how important this was and that it was a turning point.
Yeah,
I'm embarrassed to admit, I can't remember, had an ambassador been appointed by that point, or
Yeah,
no?
and James Lilly took my
Right,
place.
okay, that's right.
I think it was a turning point. It incited the students further.
Yeah, it incited the students, but it also foreshadowed what was going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. All right. I think let's have one more, and then right here, and I think we'll make this the last question.
Winston, would you be able to speak about the role of your mother in shaping your life and decision to go into diplomacy?
Sorry, say that one more time?
The role of your mother in shaping your decision to go into diplomacy. I know that we've discussed her own quite formidable career in politics and foreign policy. Your mother. Sorry.
Something about your mother, Winston. I'm not.
Yeah.
All right.
The role of my mother in career?
What was the role of your mother
Yeah,
in shaping your career?
Tremendous inspiration. My mother was a Pillsbury, very privileged family. Her first job after college was helping women in Harlem. That was her whole direction of her whole life. She was a forerunner for women in those days, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Women were supposed to be terrible mothers if they had a career. And she was a fabulous mother, but she also inspired me by her example, by her conversations. What she did, I've been surrounded by strong women ever since, my wife, my daughter-in-law, my mother-in-law. So in general terms, in terms of strength of women, and nobody's stronger than a Shanghai woman, Orville was married to a very strong woman as well, the wonderful Bai Fang. That was an inspiration. She went on to help run Eisenhower's election campaign. She took Eleanor Roosevelt's place as ambassador to the UN. Now, it's an interesting, and I'll end up with this philosophical point about I'm a little schizophrenic in my approach to foreign policy. On the one hand, I honestly believe the realistic balance of power approach of Nixon and Kissinger, and after all, I was with Kissinger as close as associate and so on. So I subscribe greatly to a lot of the geopolitical philosophy and implementation that took place. But Kissinger was not exactly a champion of human rights, although he obviously having...
There was some retconning in his third autobiography, but yeah, keep going.
But I don't want to get into this because I have great admiration and respect for Henry. And we disagreed on the degree that human rights should be in foreign policy. He agreed it had to be an agenda, and he did do some things behind the scenes. But clearly, someone who suffered from the Holocaust was attuned to human rights, but he was worried about stability and the society falling apart, so he put his emphasis on stability. I cite that because that's one aspect of geopolitical that I believe in, but I also believe in the human rights aspect. My mother, as I said, took Eleanor Roosevelt's place for human rights ambassador. My wife was chairman of Freedom House and on the board of Freedom Forum, got a medal from President Clinton, the first Eleanor Roosevelt Award. I was chairman of the NED. My daughter-in-law works for an organization founded by Hillary Clinton that promotes women's and human rights around the world. So I've had these two strands in my own philosophic approach, and it has created some internal debate and tensions at times. But to get back, I appreciate very much you raising my mother. She is a real hero, along with my father, and was a tremendous inspiration for me.
Well, join me and Dan in thanking Winston and thanking Fletcher.